So in a previous video, I talked about the struggle of self-improvement, and I just wanted to go a little bit deeper into that and clarify some of what I had already said. I had mentioned how we often use words like growth and transformation and improvement, and how we should be careful not to take these terms too literally. The fact is that language is often very limiting, and while these words are convenient, we also need to understand them as analogies rather than taking them as literal descriptions. Because what we're referring to when we use these terms is not really about growing or transforming or improving what we are, changing into something different than what we already are. And what can actually be problematic is when we take these terms too literally, is that they suggest that we're somehow incomplete or defective or lacking in something. They suggest that something is in need of repair or fixing. But really what this is all about is coming to discover who we already are. So it's about embracing our authentic self. It's not about becoming something, but rather unbecoming what we think we are, unbecoming what we're not, in order to simply be who we've always been. So it's about removing everything that is inauthentic, everything that really stands in the way of truly seeing ourselves, expressing ourselves, simply being who we truly are. So all of the blockages, all of the resistance, all the illusions, false identifications, limiting beliefs and concepts, and so on. Getting all of that out of the way so that we can know ourselves and be ourselves truly and authentically, and live from that place of authenticity. So again, analogies can be very useful as long as we understand that they are analogies and that we don't take them literally. And so speaking of analogies, we can look at ourselves the way that a sculptor looks at stone. The sculptor knows that there's a beautiful statue somewhere within that stone. And in order to bring it out, he doesn't add anything to the stone. He doesn't change or transform the stone. All he does is remove everything that isn't that form until all that's left is the beautiful statue. So similarly, what we're doing is not trying to change ourselves or add anything, but simply removing everything that isn't who we truly are. But unlike the sculptor, we don't have to use any force to remove the false identifications, the false beliefs, and so on. As I had mentioned before, this isn't about applying any kind of effort, but merely applying awareness. So simply being in a place of observation in regard to all of these blockages, just coming to better understand them without trying to change anything. I think that many of us have an intellectual understanding that what we're dealing with here are illusions. When we talk about the false self, the ego, or the limiting beliefs, concepts, the fears, desires, suffering, and so on, we have this intellectual understanding that these are all illusory. But intellectual understanding isn't really enough. We need to have the experiential insight, because otherwise we don't fully understand the illusory nature, and so these things tend to persist. What most of us do is we wage a war against the false self. We see it as a struggle of some sort. And I was just having this conversation with a friend who said that he's been struggling like this for years. And he asked, when does the battle end? Well, the battle ends when we stop fighting. Because what really gives power to these illusory forces is our resistance to them. If we look at them and understand what they are, they're all some form of resistance. So whether it's fear or desire, attachment, suffering, all of these are a form of resistance. We're resisting what is. We're resisting this moment. We're resisting our circumstances and so on. And when we struggle against that resistance, what is that struggle? The struggle itself is more resistance. So we're only adding to the overall resistance. And this is why it becomes so difficult. This is why the more we fight that battle, the weaker we feel, the more overwhelmed, exhausted, and defeated, because we're creating more of the very thing that we're trying to be rid of. So this is where I talk about the way of least resistance, or non-resistance, of effortless effort, of simply allowing everything to be as it is. So if we're resisting, we can simply notice how it isn't working. And then we can ask ourselves, what's the alternative? What's the opposite of resistance? So the opposite of resistance is acceptance and surrender. And you'll notice that this doesn't require any kind of effort whatsoever. If it feels like there's an effort to accept and surrender, then that just means that we're still in some place of resistance. And all we need to do is just be aware of that, just to notice it. If we say, I'm trying to be more accepting, for example, the trying means that we're applying some kind of force, which essentially is a form of resistance. So again, this is not about trying, not about forcing anything, not about striving and struggling, but just letting go of all of that and simply allowing everything to be as it is. So this means fully accepting everything, including the fears, including the suffering, and just coming to a place of acknowledging that it's there, and we're not going to try to push it out. We're not going to fight it, but simply notice it. Just observe it in order to better understand it. So once again, if we're resisting these things, then we're only empowering them. If we understand that all of these things are illusions, that fear is an illusion, and suffering is an illusion, ego is an illusion, etc., then what gives power to them is resistance. So when we're fighting or struggling with these illusions, our very struggle itself is rooted in the belief that these things are powerful. And so we feel we have to exert an effort to overcome them. But it's that very belief that they're powerful that gives them their power in the first place. So fighting with them seems only to increase their power. Resisting resistance is basically fighting fire with fire. At the point that we stop feeding these illusions by giving them that kind of power through our resistance, we can simply observe them without any struggle or fighting, without running away or trying to bury them, because avoidance is also a form of resistance, but simply just allowing everything to be as it is and to just look at it with a kind of innocent curiosity, just wanting to know what it is by doing nothing more than simply looking at it. And then we can move beyond just having an intellectual understanding that these things are illusory. We can see the illusory nature of them ourselves clearly, and then we can truly know experientially how they arise in the mind, just noticing whenever we're feeling any sort of resistance, and instead of trying to push it away or fight against it, we're just looking at it. And if we find ourselves resisting the resistance, again, we don't need to apply any effort in regard to that. We can just notice, but just notice when we're doing it without any sort of judgment. Just seeing how it's arising, just watching it and being aware of it, and being aware of how it may be distracting us from where we are and what we're doing in that moment, and then simply and gently bringing our attention back to this moment. What I want to add here is that we need to be very patient with ourselves and not expect immediate results. And although we might grasp these ideas with the intellect, that's not enough to resolve it. We might think, okay, I understand this, I get it, it makes sense, but I'm still overwhelmed with fear, or with grief, or suffering, or attachment, or whatever it might be. So what am I doing wrong? And it's not that we're doing anything wrong. In fact, we need to get rid of the idea that there is anything wrong with us at all. Again, it's not enough to simply understand these things conceptually with the mind. In fact, being too attached to concepts can often be one of the things that's limiting us. So we need to just put aside the concepts and just be aware of what's going on. Concepts mean that we're caught in a thought process. And this is not about thinking, it's about seeing. So we don't really need to think hard about any of it. We just need to observe. And so the thing to understand is that these patterns are deeply ingrained in us, deeply ingrained in the subconscious. So it can take some time to fully acknowledge and understand them. And that's why I emphasize patience and compassion for oneself. Not that you should put any pressure on yourself. This is about taking all of the pressure off. And when I talk about these patterns, I'm not just referring to the negative beliefs and that sort of thing, but also the very struggle to change is itself a deeply ingrained pattern or habit. We're in this habit of fighting with ourselves. So even that can take time to fully understand and resolve. So just be very patient with yourself. So it's like a practice, except we're not exerting any force. But we can't just expect to, we can't take in all this information and then just expect everything to automatically change. We have to apply it, which means not using mental energy to think about it, but relaxing into awareness in order to simply see. And there's going to be moments where you fall back into these patterns, but rather than trying to pull yourself out of it, you just notice when it's happening. You just watch it and bring attention to it. And what we're doing is simply bringing awareness back to the moment, to being in the space of observing everything, just watching the patterns without any sort of resistance. And so when you notice that you're slipping or that you've already slipped and you're deep in it, then you just notice that. You don't need to try to pull yourself out of it. It's like quicksand, for example. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. And what's really interesting about quicksand is that the way to get free of it is to simply relax and lay down. And what this does is it allows your body essentially to float. And then you can gently make your way out of it. And the gentler, the better. So it's the same way when we feel like we're drowning in these mental and emotional patterns. The more we struggle to overcome fear, depression, heartache, or whatever it might be, the more deeply we sink into it. So there comes a point where we just need to surrender to the moment, to take a deep breath and relax. And as soon as we stop resisting, we just relax into it. Suddenly we realize that we can float, and very gently and very lovingly we can float our way out of it.